I've given money to homeless people, right? Like most people have at some point.
Sure.
Like, is that the best use of funds? Not necessarily. Does it help someone? Yes. So it's fine to do.
Does it? I don't know if it does. Hey everybody, so today on the podcast I've got a little bit of a blast from the past. He's certainly blasted, and he's in the realm of rockets blasting off, I guess. So he won over 18 million from live MTTs, and he's won who knows how much more in cash games as well. He did a bit of both, and he co-founded Reg with Liv Boeree, which is Rational Effective Giving. Along with Philip Gruesome, I believe, but I believe you guys weren't you guys the first two original founders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it started with Phil and me doing just like a matching challenge where we were raising during Bahamas 2014 for two organizations, and we said, hey, we'll double
Before we get into that, I just want to throw out, because people like to know a little bit more about why we should all listen to you. I mean, you were in control of, you raised in the first 2 years $1.5 million and got the attention of some really big names. Eventually, Elon Musk himself, and potentially had the capacity to shift, billions of dollars, towards positive causes. And also, I do want to I thought I was referring to you and Liv Boeree. I'd like to hear the story in a second of how this happened, because it really is a big thing. A lot of poker players did donate, and I also considered supporting it myself, although I understood you guys. There's a bit more to the story, but why don't you tell the story again with you and Philip, and was it you two, or was it Liv, that actually created this thing?
So we all came together. There was also a fourth person, Stefan Huber, who kind of initially introduced me to the now often hated effective altruism, which has initially informed my philanthropic thinking quite a bit. Anyhow, so Phil and I wanted to do a matching challenge because we got into philanthropy in early 2014 during Bahamas. And we wrote out a post, but our English wasn't that great at the time, and may still not be as good as of others, obviously. But so we asked Liv to help translate it from our German English into proper British English. And as she was translating it, or rather improving, she got curious about what this thing is that we're raising for, and immediately got involved. So she was there from the beginning, but not for the initial matching challenge.
She's about the whole prospect of it all. And certainly it sounds really appealing to myself, because a lot of giving is in fact irrational. If you get to the core of it, you can see irrational sides of it. I want to talk a lot about that, because I personally was led in certain directions for where I went with rationally applying stuff in it. But it is a bit of a complicated debate of where I think it's often complicated, but I have my own beliefs of where's rational to give money to, and depends on how you look at a lot of things. I believe it can be solved. I really do. Even though usually my intuition's right about these things, but I'm not that educated on it. It turns out that charity and giving actually is really complicated, and creating positive impact by itself tends to be complicated. There's lots of heuristics for it, just like there are in poker. But I want to go back to the origins of all this. How did you decide to go from making millions in poker to working on giving your money away and not making much money, presumably not as much money as you would if you just focused on poker? How do you make this shift in where you put your efforts and your value and your time, from enjoying your life presumably in the more common sense kind of way, you have money and do whatever you want, to I'm going to put my effort into something as complicated as effective giving? I really want to know how that all started.
Yeah, I want to quickly just comment on the rational part as well that you mentioned. I'm a bit more careful with the word. I think people can give for many reasons, and one of them is to fill some inner preference one has, or because they want to feel good, or because they want to help avoid the issue in the world that their parents maybe suffered by. I think it's not irrational to do that. It's just that if it was the case that the giving that one aims to do has the goal of helping most people per dollar spent, then I think those things apply of let's be quantified about it, let's use the scientific method, etc. And then the
Sure.
rational or effective approach, I think, makes sense. Otherwise, I think it's fine. And I do personally also give to, like, I mean, I've given money to homeless people, right? Like most people have at some point.
Sure.
Like, is that the best use of funds? Not necessarily. Does it help someone? Yes. So it's fine to do.
Does it? I don't know if
I
it
don't know. I
does.
think it's hard to imagine that it is destructive to them. I don't know how effective it is. It maybe the primary thing it does is make you feel good for a moment.
It can be
I don't have a strong
destructive, but I
opinion
want
on
to
it.
talk a bit. I mean, I want to talk. This is a conversation for a little bit, but let's talk about like
Right.
poker, making money, making those dollar bills to helping people.
Yeah, so I was playing poker from about 2010, I think, as a full-time thing. And the thing about poker is that it does provide some entertainment value, but in the end, it's a very self-serving pursuit, right? Like relative to even a software engineer at some company, you're usually developing a product, and then a bunch of people use the product, and you helped a little bit with it. It's like, okay, you've contributed to society or whatever you want to call it, or to civilizational progress in some way. Whereas with poker, I had a lot of fun playing it. It was kind of something where my light gambling addiction, as Doyle says, just found a game that he can beat. I think it was Doyle. And yeah, that applied to me as well. So it was incredibly fun. I think it does provide entertainment value to people. It's kind of small relative to other sports though. And it also definitely teaches you a bunch of valuable ways of thinking. There's no doubt around that. But I always thought that the impact on civilization is kind of small, and I always wanted to do something outside of just focusing on games. So that's why I was looking for what to do. And as then in 2013, through Stefan Huber, I stumbled on philanthropy that tries to be effective and kind of use the scientific method in figuring out where to give money rather than not use it and just do an emotional giving approach. I just was really into the idea of combining the two things, and that's why we started Reg in the end, because it allowed for still playing poker for the next years. I didn't want to stop, but also I was spending probably, depending on the year, between 20 to 35% of my time on Reg, and the rest on poker. And that allowed kind of for the years of 2014 to 2019 to get some experience in another way of having output in the world as well. And then during COVID, I initially just played 2 months straight, as many did, because the online games were nuts, and just like won a ton in the first month and then lost it all back and was at perfect zero over 2 months roughly, and looked at it and just get that feeling again of, wow, I've just spent like 12 hours a day, 55 out of 60 days playing, and there's just, I had an experience. That's what I had, right? That's if you didn't get what you wanted, you got experience. That's kind of what I ended up with. And then I just looked out into the world and what else do I want to do, and had an opportunity where I was teaching some people from Bridgewater Poker. They were teaching me economics, and through that, then I was more interested to do something else than poker. And then an opportunity came around where I had already paused playing poker for a few months, and then Elon was looking for some advice with his foundation, so I started advising the foundation first, and then over the next 1.5 years took up various roles in the end, leading the strategy and grant analysis at the foundation as well.
Okay, well, congratulations. I think that I actually was not really. I didn't realize that poker had much to do with effective altruism, but I think it actually has quite a lot to do with it, as it turns out. Although it's not very obvious. I got to things in a little bit different of a pathway, but yeah, I mean, definitely I've felt the experiences of feeling like I've wasted my time, but I believe that that's actually a little bit of a delusion. Um, for a couple of reasons. Mostly because like it's part of like kind of the bigger picture. Because you still like the process of learning Luscious is just another version of variance in disguise. Is the way that I look at it. But personally, what really hit
100%. By
me
the way,
was
I didn't mean to say that it's a waste of time. I am very, very happy about having spent 10 years in poker full time, and especially having done so during the age like in my 20s. It's like, when else do you want to travel the world and be
oh
free? Do you
yeah,
want to do it in your
yeah,
60s? It's better to do it in the 20s or 30s. And as you say, like, so many valuable lessons I learned from it
yeah.
that I wouldn't have learned, and you wouldn't have learned, if we just worked in like at a bank doing some financial analysis of whatever
Yeah.
insurances.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, poker in many ways uh, it strengthens the muscle of critical thinking um, through a lot of incomplete information, which is very much applicable to the real world. I view it as sort of like a training
Cool.
ground towards real world problems. You start dealing with people, which for the most part, or nearly 100%, I would say, are essentially like probabilistic machines. This might be a bit of a controversial view. I wonder what your view is on this. But like, if you
Whether
do
it's human as a
something,
probabilistic machine.
well, yeah, I mean, like you could view it as that, except you don't have the assigned probabilities. This
I
is how
think,
I generally.
yeah,
Not everyone functions 100% like this, but it's damn near close.
I think
Especially a lot of people.
I would split between what is my like knowledge, basically the epistemics of the situation. That is probabilistic, probably, but the ontology, the reality of the human, is probably that they're not quite a probabilistic machine. Would be my take.
Well, that's so you agree with me. I also say not quite. Because, but a lot of people, in most circumstances, you can attribute most of their actions to probabilistic realities. Like, if you do good to someone, there's a really high chance they return good back. You can even look through the course of evolution and see why that is. Because, like, you'd rather treat someone good who treats you good, and so they're likely to continue the cycle of doing good for each other. And there's like a percent chance that they say "fuck you," I'm gonna like take that and go walk away, and they end this cycle of reoccurring goodness, etc. But it's hard to tell exactly how that shows up, but to some extent, potentially this can be measured. I
Yeah,
think.
and you can improve the probabilities of it occurring one way or the other as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing I was pointing at, there is a split that I think sometimes is quite relevant, actually, between is it probabilistic because of the inherent kind of incomplete knowledge that we have, and therefore there is uncertainty, or is the thing at a base reality level uncertain? Like quantum phenomena are on the base reality level uncertain, right? Like, or rather probabilistic. Well, or they occur with different weights in many ways, depends on which theory you believe in. But
So I think. Go ahead. Go ahead. Actually.
no, so that's why I think that our perception of a human is and their actions is often probabilistic, but I think it's mostly because we don't have sufficient knowledge. Where if we kind of ask them the right questions, then the uncertainty goes down, right? And then it can nearly become deterministic as well.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, yeah, that's true. But certain people function in different ways. It depends on what this is one of the concepts in AI of like how the AI is going to turn out, which is the value loading system, I believe it's called. And in people have different value loading systems, and a lot of people have a high value loading system in belonging, which makes them much less likely to think in ways that deter against that. I mean, it's pretty easy to see this. It just basically means a lot of people follow the pack, and this makes them much more deterministic if they keep doing stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately, you're kind of right. Is that there's parts of humanity or whatever being aliveness is that virtually cannot be deterministic. They just probably are going to come from the guys that or people, or women or whatever that don't care that much about like going along with the crowd. That's what I think.
Yeah, I agree that it's funny that you pointed out the main value to be belonging. that's kind of my slightly sometimes controversial take, is that people, but I suppose it's not that controversial. It's actually quite clear that people more optimize for belonging and connection than truth or
I
something.
was thinking exactly the same thing. I mean, this
Yeah.
is one of the reasons why, we see in the world today where, especially in Western world, where it's a bit scarier to tell the truth, and there's all this like parabolic downside or whatever, and a lot of society is kind of taught to like give lots of white lies and
Mhm.
things of this nature, but it ultimately still causes all kinds of problems throughout. I mean, I've noticed it myself; it just drives me crazy. So that's why part of the reason why I built the podcast is I just can't stand it. It's like I gotta do something, um, and yeah, I mean it's understandable because through that lens, if you value belonging, which makes sense, like if you don't belong to a group, you're kind of screwed in the real world, especially really complicated real world, and telling the truth too much pisses off a lot of people. Not
I
everyone,
would
but it
actually
pisses off.
say that we're less screwed today than kind of from where our desire to belong has evolved to exist in the first place. Because now, if you get ostracized from one group, like the internet is so large, you can find whatever, create whatever belief system you want, and you'll find someone who believes it, right?
Oh yeah,
You'll
yeah,
find some
that's a fair
Facebook
point.
group. No one uses Facebook anymore, but apparently 3 billion people still do. So I suppose people do still use Facebook.
Well, so as traveling in many different places, there are cultures, by the way, that absolutely do tell the truth, even in situations where people assumed that it was just totally default not to.
Hmm.
They'll like tell you point blank in like Eastern Europe or Israel or whatever, like what the truth is.
Hmm.
But the whole way their culture works is different. Or in India, for example, like a lot of things
Hmm.
work very differently there. Like dating, for example, it's one of the biggest ones. And then just the
Japan
way
is the
people do
opposite, right?
business is quite different. Huh?
Is Japan the opposite of that, roughly?
Uh, I don't know. I don't know enough about Japan to say, but one thing I can
Hmm.
say about Japan, having been there especially recently, Japan is unique in that that respect is really, really highly valued. And if you go there and you're something like 2 minutes late, it's considered very rude. It's like something that you like almost don't want to show yourself for something if
You
you're
have to
not
make
there.
up
Like
some
you
reason.
legit get like I'm not even kidding. Like there's it's a kind of a funny thing in Japan because I was sitting there even thinking I was going to do research on this. I was wondering like what is the problem with this country? People are like programmed to be so nice based off of each other, and it just proved that people could in fact like do things like never be late. I mean, they were a little bit too extreme that they'd always be like 10 minutes early. And I think like sometimes you should be late actually, and it's not really a big deal. But
That's funny.
but
I,
not usually.
yeah.
I don't think I think I need more Japanese military discipline.
So poker
But
players wouldn't make it in Japan, is what you're saying.
yeah, in Japan I'd have some problems. But actually, I think it would be good training to just like stay there and develop the
Right.
habit because I think it's solvable. But anyway, I'm not sure about Japan, but definitely in those cultures, in the Asian cultures, it's like more likely you don't want to be so. Typically, you don't want to be so confrontational, but this is less true of China, from my experience.
Hmm.
For some reason, China has a much more complicated history. Um, but in a lot of Western cultures, I can say that it looks as though creating enemies or making people dislike you, at least on the surface, will hurt your ability to succeed in the long run. So they like do this thing of like not telling truth in order to not be disliked, as my personal theory in
Hmm.
like London and Los Angeles, and they want people to like, yeah. I mean, it's a bit more manipulative in these kinds of places, but
Yeah,
or at
totally.
least not losing sights on the long term anyway. What's your experience like with dealing with the people in effective altruism? Have you found that the same lessons from poker carry over? Have you found that these people to be good to deal with? I would think. Well, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to.
Hmm.
What's that world been like compared to the poker world?
Yeah, so I lived in London for the 2010s basically, and then I moved to Oxford in 19, 20, 21, and in large part to live closer to the effective altruism community that existed in Oxford. Well, it also existed in London, but in Oxford were some of the kind of like focal intellectual points of the EA community. So Bostrom, Will McCaskill, etc., lived there. So yeah, so the benefit from Oxford was that much of the kind of intellectual center of effective altruism was at the time in Oxford, and I wanted to be closer to that and to just interact. You end up interacting with people much more if you live 15 or 3 minutes away than 45, right? So
Oh yeah, for sure.
by a lot actually. And so we moved there. Also, we lived in the countryside, which was nice. And yeah, there are quite a few similarities. Probably the kind of being a bit on the spectrum rate is even higher in EA than it is in poker. I think like in
Oh
EA
really?
it's something like a third of people or so. It's
That's
kind of
kind of
crazy.
crazy.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's very high. It's well, it's somewhat, I suppose, unsurprising, but only in hindsight maybe. Where one thing that is being done by EA is kind of an emphasis or arguably an overemphasis on quantification and numbers and breaking everything down into
Oh, I
systems,
see.
etc. Right? So that
Yeah.
comes very natural for people who just can sit for a long time with numbers and sheets and figure out like formula,
Sure.
etc.
Well, a lot of the aliens kind of traits do exist in the, in the spectrum of like the whatever's out there. And by definition, autism tends to be on the other stuff that's not necessarily relevant to like how we developed as like, animal society or whatever it is. By the way, another funny thing is that I don't agree, by the way, with the utilitarian view 100%. I think there's lots of
Me
truth in
neither,
it
by the
with the
way.
moral. Okay, let's get into that a little bit later. But one thing I want to mention is that it turns out there was some studies in autism, and it turns out a lot of them actually tend to be much more on the pure side, an egalitarian kind of view of like looking at things, which I found to be interesting. I'd have to dig up the study, but just basically like a lot less corruption exists within that, and also that is a bit of an alien view as
Hmm.
well. In order to think this in a kind of way, you need to like see things from this like really distant perspective
Hmm.
of like see things from like a theory that doesn't really exist of the world where everyone helps each other and everyone's one or whatever you want to call it. Well, this only really exists out in fucking infinity. It doesn't
Hmm.
really exist in like the real world where people should form groups in a lot of situations. Well, I don't want to use the word should, but if you look at things in terms of closed games, etc., makes much more sense. But when you do consider things out into infinity, this is where morality seems to have more of have more of how do you say like a foot to stand on. It's like why do all these nice things
Hmm.
that benefit. I've asked myself these kinds of questions. Why do nice things? This is where I came to my conclusions about rational effective giving myself. Well, not the foundation, but the whole premise was like, why do these things? It basically is like betting on infinity, from my point of
Wait,
view, to start
so
doing
you're
good
saying
things.
that in the infinite case, do you mean that it's an infinite game, kind of, that always lasts, or which infinity part do you
Yes.
mean? Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
like an iterative back and forth, etc. Situation.
Yes, but this is also optimal from my point of view because
Yeah,
it
I mean, it
looks like
allows for
all their pathways of action essentially lead to zero, which would be death, or that everything's pointless, uh, like more or
Wait, where
less.
where do all pathways lead to zero?
Well, when you start taking actions that do things that are short term beneficial, it begs the question like where well
Oh, you mean that you get a much higher payoff if you're focusing on the long term when the long term is very large?
yeah, the only hypothetical payoff that's the largest possible is actually infinity. The ones that bet on infinity, where it
Yeah.
suggests something like infinite virtue.
So I'm
The
kind of
all
in
the
two minds about this because I think infinity is just such a weird thing where it's unsurprising that things become very different when you multiply by infinity, right? Like then you do get very different values. And I'm not
yes,
sure that that's fair to do. We're not even sure on infinity in the first place, right? Like we don't know whether the universe will last forever. Like presently, our current understanding of physics says that we'll end up with a heat death in whatever 10 to 100 years or so, and
hmm
then there will be no interaction ever anymore of anything. Who knows? Maybe then the universe reforms or something. But like our current understanding says that there is no infinity potentially. Also, we don't have anything smaller than the Planck length. So the size of it, it's like discrete at the bottom and finite at the top. So again, it's not infinite. So it might turn out that it is not discrete at the bottom and that it does last infinitely long. But I think the reasons to not use infinities, especially in moral reasoning, are pretty strong. Also because
I
most of
agree.
the time for you get away with saying like a million years or something like this, which is the average lifetime of a species is like
That's
2 million years.
effectively infinity. But yeah.
Exactly. Like for much of the math that you're thinking about in that example, where like your immediate short-term action of eating the chocolate cake versus something else, like does have higher payoff already if you look at a million or so years. And then the people that claim that, hey, you're doing a wrong thing, which I think is justified by using infinities, yeah, wouldn't make that statement.
Well, I would say the biggest error towards that is basically it's like almost impossible to see or feel something like at infinity, and to communicate, especially how to feel it, is
Hmm.
extremely difficult because you can think one thing, but whatever you're biologically conditioned to feel can be totally something different.
Totally.
Especially when it comes to doing things that your impulse really is programmed against. And this begs the question: okay, well, if we're thinking about things like this, how do we fix people to behave better? This
Hmm.
opens up a massive thing, which is what I'm personally more interested in working on. But I understand you have different things that you focus on in rational effective giving, like particularly against really high security risk type things for
Hmm.
the population, such as
Hmm.
virus control and other kinds of things where people are naturally not likely to view these as large risk, but actually they really are, especially with like the power of technology increasing.
Hmm.
Do you want to expound on that?
Yeah. So the thing initially when we started Reg, we focused on human suffering alleviation today, so like global health type stuff, and then we added animal welfare and existential risk prevention. And existential risk work ended up being the thing I was most drawn to, interested in, and ended up doing because it, at the time at least, we're talking like 2014, 15, 16, 17, it was just getting very little attention. Topics like pandemic risk and AI safety were pandemics, at least people were okay with you discussing, but they did seem very infrequent, and hopefully still are. And AI risks where you're just a weirdo every time talking about it. Now, obviously, that's
Really?
very, in 2017,
Seems like
18,
so.
19, like just discussing, one, people thought that we're in a long plateau of AI potentially still, or that right now we'll get a little hype and then it's going to go away because that's what happened roughly every 20 to 30 years since the invention of computers.
That seems like a stupid way of looking at it. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, people
why
aren't.
should that trend continue? I mean,
Yeah,
against with
I
something
agree.
that technology is an exponential upside, or what's the word? Exponential curve of like its progress, especially since the last
Well,
like 100 years. It's ridiculous to look at things like this.
yeah. So one, we're not designed to internalize exponential curves very well, right? Like our
Sure.
kind of ability to project them into the future is just inherently linear rather than exponential. And
Oh,
then
by the way,
also,
this.
yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and finish your thought? I had another thought.
Yeah,
Go
and
ahead.
then specifically with AI, it actually happened to be the case that there were AI hype phases in the past where people thought that we'll get to some breakthrough came about, some new way of developing it, and then people thought that we'll get to just computers being able to solve tons of tasks for us already at the time, and then that got disproven twice. So actually, people that were saying that we might be in another short-term hype phase rather than it continues, were just pointing at the past, which is not a bad argument to choose, but it did seem that
Seems
this
pretty
time was
bad.
different. I agree, and that's why we focused on it as well at the time, because this time
Seems
did
like
seem very different.
it's just like put out like a bunch of artists out of business, and like people can use like deep fakes and like even like
Yeah.
movies and all this crazy shit, and people can use that to hack and cheat, which is also like a wild security risk that's coming up. That's like a very real security risk.
It's
If you're
only been
like
a
not
year
engaging.
since ChatGPT got released, like 15 months or so. The world's
Yeah, yeah,
already kind of different.
and that's like
I interact with it quite a bit. Coding improved in effectiveness a lot. I was making a birthday present where I was, I will have gifted it at the time of release, so I can say it, where I was just designing some cards, and I just did it all in Midjourney, and it just takes no
really.
time. Previously, you would have had to hire an artist and describe it and then go back and forth. And now I just Midjourney it within like a few moments and just have awesome art. It's crazy.
Yeah, really. Wow. Yeah, yeah. I mean, AI is definitely going to be the future, just as it was in poker. I mean, it just has to be used really to
Right.
get
Yeah.
good
That
at
was a
these
motivator
things.
to quit poker, by the way, when the Noam Brown's team, I forget what they're called, but 2017, 2019.
So Carnegie Mellon, maybe.
Yeah, he was at Carnegie Mellon first, and he went to Facebook Research. And first they did the beat the heads up players, right? And then it was partially the same team that ended up beating the Six Max game, where they played
Oh,
with Nick
really?
Petrangelo and a few others
Oh, I
in
didn't know about
2019.
that. Yeah. I mean, that's like a decent reason to quit poker. So there's all kinds of ways for it to flourish, and
Totally.
like I mean, you just change some variables. I don't know how quick to adapt these AI things are if we just change the structure of the game.
I fully agree. I was looking at that with a friend in 2020 to kind of figure out a way how to easily change it up. And
Hmm.
one thing was I think that would be interesting if anyone wants to try it, because basically all the training that currently exists in, what are they called, the tools, like something Wizard, GTO Wizard, that's the fast one right now, right? Anyway, but it's run on a full card deck. If you just remove 2 cards, show them openly, you have 2,500 decks already. You just at random remove 2 cards at the beginning of the game. You can probably bunch
That's an
the two.
interesting idea.
Because the goal of the design should be something that is similar enough such that people don't have to relearn a whole new game and concept, but also different enough such that it makes it harder for solvers.
What
And
about different? What about different anti structures and blind structures?
You could try. I think you could try that. I think just adding a number of things. The reason why I like the card removal is because people are already familiar with the card being dead and having to adjust in their mind to it, right? Whereas if you change the anti and blind structure a lot, now people are like, oh, I like this other variant more. I feel like just taking 2 cards out, people just
So
know
like,
internally immediately. But yeah, you could do
oh,
tons
that
of stuff. You could just add an ocean or whatever, right? Like fourth card to come out also changes everything.
Ooh, oh, that's crazy. Okay. Well, people are doing kind of related things. They made things quite a bit more complicated by introducing this idea of like you pay like a massive bounty if like you don't win a pot. It's called the Squid Game, and it
Yeah,
is
I
actually a
played it
great
once
thing
in
to
a home
poker.
game.
Just
It's really
like
fun.
yeah, yeah. Some just slight permutations really things up quite a bit for like the
Hmm.
hardcore. What's the word? But the guys who like memorize every little combination and that kind of thing, and don't view the concept, which it
Right.
appears that AI has some issues with at some level, or at least isn't doing. I mean, at least seemed like humans. It seems like it hasn't quite reached that point yet. Of like, if it does reach that point of like, what's the word? I want to say analogical reasoning.
Hmm.
Maybe that's byproduct of artificial general intelligence. I believe that's where it is. If it
Hmm.
reaches that point, it sounds like it'd be some really serious threats. Is that right?
I mean, yeah, could come out in 2 ways. One would be that it just saw situations and uses them again for another situation by analogy, and the other one, maybe it's just so good that you throw a new situation at it, and you can run it within a day, and it has this solution from first principles again for like a new game, right? That's what the when AlphaGo, the program that beat the best Go player in the world at the time, came out, they then later reran. They improved the algorithm where they didn't preload the human games, but just let it play against itself and self-generate the trillions of situations.
It's not really the same thing. I mean, that's the cheap way. That's the way that doesn't really work for real world situations.
Yeah,
Real
well,
world's
yeah,
much
because it's
more
too many
complicated than this.
degrees of freedom in the real world for sure. Yeah.
Sure.
In Go, you can only make that many moves, even though Go is a lot of moves, more than poker.
Sure.
But yeah,
Okay. By the way, the example that you were talking about like discussing AI, is like something that kind of gets at the point I was referring to with morality, right? Like the highest EV thing to do as far as like opening up a discussion would be for like the collective would be to talk about AI if it truly is like the biggest threat. No one's giving it any attention, right? Because it's just like this massive gaping hole, but it hurts yourself a lot to do that, at least temporarily. Like maybe at some point people realized, but God knows when, where they realize, oh shit, that guy was right, that weirdo that kept talking about AI, and actually we should be congratulating him, but he might be dead at that point. In which case, so it begs the question of like, what is the point of doing all this stuff? And the hope is that in fact there is like an afterlife and there's some kind of weird justice out there. But
yeah.
if not,
I don't
it
want to bet on
means
that. I feel like even if there is an afterlife, you're still supposed to make the best of your life here. And yeah,
well,
I
that's
mean,
the idea.
yeah, you don't want to be the. It's funny that if you actually, I'm not saying that we did at all avert the bad things, but it's like this idea of like, oh, I went back into the time. I went into the time machine. I went back in time, and I killed Gestafelstein or something. It's like, wait, who did you kill? It's like, I don't know who you're talking about. It's like, damn, it worked, but now the threat also disappeared, right? So that might happen with AI, but currently a lot of people are paying attention to AI. So it's not right. It's not the case anymore as it was previously that anyone mentioning AI risks is seen as a weirdo, because prior it was a lot premised on the idea that AI is just not going to be capable enough within the future. And now it's very clear that it's capable, but now people also think that, well, the benefits outweigh the negatives. And for what it's worth, I also think so. The benefits of AI will outweigh the negatives. It's just that it's such a high variance path. There are so many incredible benefits, but also they are there because it's so insanely powerful and it's going to be integrated in our lives so much. So that also has the potential of the power running out poorly, where it ends up being very bad. And I just want to make sure that we kind of avoid the bad path, or help at least think through how we get there to avoid that, because then we can reap the amazing benefits. I think the world will be so much richer in experience and wealth and everything with AI than without.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. I think part of this is a little bit of a trap because so another thing is it's a bit of a trap to keep chasing well, it's done in a bit, but to like always like aim for the value of what's better and better, in spite of other things, in spite of something like truth, for example. If it's forfeited at the expense of that, it will eventually lead towards a bit of a collapse of a bunch of issues. I think, but the biggest thing is that the way that you feel is adjusted because it's always relative. Like it has to, even if it continually accelerates, I guess that's good, but it then begs the question of like how is it going to continually accelerate? I mean, even if we're all injected into the metaverse, we would just get adjusted to that metaverse, and then that would become the new reality because everything would be defined relative to each other. So
Yeah,
like,
I see what you
do you
mean.
know
So
what I
you're
mean? It
making
would be
so you're making the point that we'll basically kind of hedonic treadmill, like we'll always get used to the new thing, and if our happiness or satisfaction or meaning or whatever is built on comparative stuff rather than absolute, then that's not going to be that relevant for the total. I'm not quite. I think the comparative part is large, but I don't think it's the only part. Basically, in a world where, imagine a world where everyone just has their legs just hurt all the time. It's just everyone's legs are designed such that they're in actual pain, not such that the brain is tuning it out, but such that you actually experience pain all the time and you're not walking, etc. I feel like that, I mean, obviously that's not a proof, but I can't imagine that that one is in total life satisfaction no worse than the world where everyone is like physically extremely healthy. It just seems like there are some there is comparative stuff, like comparing your like wealth to your neighbor or whatever, but there is also, I think, some hard truths, like how often do you get pain neurons firing in your head, like the fewer pain signals you get, the better. I think that one is a hard truth.
No, that's true.
Or like how many
I mean,
moments of pure awe do you experience, right? Like everyone had
sure.
something where they were so in love with someone that it was amazing, right? And it's like,
Sure.
okay, do you want to have that experience once or 10 times? 10 times is better than once.
Sure. Oh yeah. No, it should get in the case that you gave, it should get diminishingly bad. But of course, like, what is hell would be defined by as more than that. It would be like it would be things getting actually poker actually can kind of simulate both heaven and hell to a fair degree because it requires an element of unpredictability. The best possible situation is where things get better overall on average and unpredictably so. But if you take out the element of unpredictability, now you get rid of elements. You probably get rid of like a feeling like of awe. Like you can't really feel awe if like
That's
you're gonna
interesting.
get pizza every fucking day, right? And even if
Yeah,
you like
I
pizza,
actually agree with that. That sounds cool. It
huh?
sounds very true to me that you do need unpredictability, because the moment of surprise is kind of relevant for experience to be novel in the first place, and probably you need constant new bads for hell and constant new goods for heaven.
Yeah. I mean, these are basically the kind of pathways to get to where I decided to go to for my own like personal route towards effective altruism. Is like, what's the point of anything? If like whatever, it was just this guy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, even like said like you can justify any evil if there's no afterlife, if there's no infinity, rather, or some variation of infinity, million years or whatever. That was like a big thing, was like putting into all these thought experiments. And actually, in the topic of AI, they started to like play with this idea. I was actually reading a book Liv Boeree was suggesting of super intelligence, where they started to play with the idea of like different value loading situations. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that basically their the values that they've loaded into the mind, however, through their experiences or however it exists or through their genes, are what dictate all the differences in like what's quote unquote good and bad from the cultural significances. And this kind of gets at an important point in the theory of good and bad. I do not agree that it's 100% relative. I think there's a way to solve it actually, but
yeah, by the
big
way, with
part
the
of it
Russians, don't
is,
forget, like
huh?
the Russians make many very depressing arguments. That doesn't mean they gotta also look a bit at like where they live. It's always fucking cold and difficult, and
Well,
I
that's.
want to just go back into my little hut and hopefully I can warm myself. It's
I mean,
yeah, then
that's
you'll
also part
write
of.
depressing literature.
I think that's also where like that's also kind of indicative of the way that the environment has kind of shaped their source of beliefs to,
Right.
or their ways of like looking at things in terms of value. It shapes their values to a degree because like they as a through population have like oriented to be rewarded more towards not really expecting highly of things and blah 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 blah, and so it leads people to be a bit more cold. I mean, it's just like the bias of like that whole generation to a degree. I would personally say, but and, the idea of these AIs playing with the different value loadings leads to some really crazy possibilities, such as if the AI even has good intentions and decides, okay, this was an example from the book. Okay, we're gonna make everyone happy, and it decides, through the utilitarian logic, okay, it's actually good if we make everyone happy by hooking everyone up to machines and just like stimulating positive feelings for everyone, just making everyone smile all the time.
Right.
And it doesn't take much
Like the
introspection or
Matrix,
common
basically.
sense to see that this sucks. This is not the idea of how this would work. But something like this could absolutely happen. Even like a small subset or whatever it is, and just create some really weird possibilities. Or some machine could just they make too much of something, like make too many paper clips or whatever, that ends up screwing everything over. I mean, there's lots of it seemed like impossible to prevent AI from like screwing up in some major way when you
Yeah,
looked
the
at
thing.
all the different possibilities.
Uh, uh, the thing you describe is kind of one can look at different categories of risks. And at the time, so if you're at superintelligence, I think that came out in like 2015 or so, people
Mm-hmm.
were quite concerned with the idea of rogue AIs. So you create the model and implement it into the world, and it ends up doing what you didn't want it to do. Like, for
Sure.
example, you wanted it to create happiness and it just like found some hack around it, because the whole reason to use AI in the first place is that it's going to consider strategies and tactics that you might not have thought of, right? That's what being more intelligent is, at least one of the things it means. Anyway,
Yeah.
so, and then it ends up doing something that you wouldn't want it to do. So, well, you should have written your code better or like used better data sources or something. But it's like all in the category of rogue AI. And it doesn't even have to be that it goes out and wants to destroy humans. It's just that it does something that you didn't want it to do in the first place. But then currently the thing that people worry a bit more about, or like a less kind of sci-fi lens to take, is and we can see it already with now the powerful large language models that are being used, is we are currently starting to implement more and more AI use into, for example, right now you can edit emails with it, and you already use it to edit emails, right? Later you might have it write emails once it's good enough at that, where you just like give it a short prompt. You can already do that, where you give it a short prompt and it just writes the email. Not everyone uses it for it yet, but inevitably it will become better at doing so, and you will feel like it's more effective. So if you look a few years ahead with that, then you will basically integrate the model that is designed for one task or a variety of tasks into more and more areas of your life, and it will probably over time be in the executive position in a lot of parts of the economy overall. And at that point, you'll probably not be able to turn it off. So the thing that people used to always give as an argument against any worry is that, oh, you'll just like turn off the AI. But have we, like, we see now that social media is kind of bad. We haven't turned off TikTok even in the US. We've seen like teen depression go up. For girls, it's particularly bad. Like there's just not really, and that's one company running it. With AI, it's going to be just tons of different services running tons of small parts. How do you turn it off? It's like turning off the internet at that point. It's no one is going to turn off the internet. The internet exists. It's just like it's just going to run. And the same is also true for AI. And so, and then at that point, if you look at it like what happens over the next years, it's just integrated in more and more parts of our world, which is great because things become more effective, more efficient, and grow faster. But if there are some inherent problems, one, you might not notice them because AIs also communicate to each other rather than just with humans now. Like a
Oh,
lot of the
really?
communication at that point. Well, so
It
if
sounds.
my
Yeah.
AI writes an email, then to you, your AI might write an email in response to me, and we just have a
What
conversation
the
back and forth.
fuck?
And then you and I are just given like, hey, after a long deliberation of 500,000 messages back and forth, which lasted 2 seconds, we have decided that Dan, you should do A, and Igor, you will do B. And we are just used to take that as truth because historically we perform better just going with what the smarter than us thing tells us to do. And at that point, it's like you get a lot of different potentials for bad outcomes. One is that you miss for a while that there are mistakes in the system and it slowly just like destroys some resource or value in society that you actually care a lot about. Or you could have like evolutionary effects then between the AIs, where like the AIs that are all competing with each other in the economy, they then start going through something akin to evolution, where they probably also write themselves to improve themselves. They probably want to have more space, and they might fight wars against each other. And then if we're the secondary species on planet Earth, then yeah, how do secondary species on this planet perform when we fight a war? Not so well. So like, it's more about our war. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight that because there are a number of worries around AI, but again, I think the total amount of upside that's the world I want to live in for sure. The one where we have AI everywhere and it functions well.
I mean, you do want to live there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, someone said it, I think correctly, is like, if we, just imagine like the potential for good or like for happiness. I think we are not spending as much time imagining how much better everyone could feel as we spend thinking about the negative side. So everyone knows who has done, I don't know, who's fallen in love and then had their love reciprocated and they've met for the first time. Or you've done some like in a laboratory, of course, in controlled condition, like as part of a therapy, MDMA therapy or something, and you're feeling incredibly loving and fantastic. Like, those experiences are much better than the day-to-day life, but that could be the base, I think, and then you could have much, much more above it, where like you're just creating art on a like snip of the fingers, basically, ease, and it's just fulfilling to you at all times, and it has massive variety, etc. Anyway, I think
So
it's
you
hard to
know,
imagine, but I think there's a
what
lot of upside, and I think we could get there if we have abundant intelligence, basically, and abundant energy.
So, a couple things I happen to disagree with. I feel like this has already happened, actually. In fact, in Western world, I think that a lot of people have not realized that, in fact, they are wildly perceiving the way the world works in their own like bubbled lens. In fact, there's something called what was it called? There's like an acronym called WEIRD. It refers to Western educated, independent, rich, and what's the other one? Like democratic societies, where they just don't function like normal societies,
Uh-huh.
really. And it's partly because modernization has just like brought like every desire to
Mm-hmm.
our fingertips a lot, where it gets to the point of like, oh, like why do we need to feel discomfort at all? And it gets to the point of like where, this gets back to the value loading system of, if we value pleasure so much, it makes these values of things like loyalty, for example, or even valuing truth, because truth requires some negative things to exist. If you're always searching for pleasure, you bury the truth. Um,
Yeah, by the way,
so
I'm not sure. I feel like truth is it. I don't know. I mean, at the same time, as we were talking before about the people valuing belonging above truth, and kind of that EAs are doing more of they're more on the spectrum, poker players as well. Um,
mhm,
you and me a little as well.
sure.
I would assume you consider yourself also a bit there.
No,
For you,
yeah.
it's easier, and for me as well, to like the ratio of truth to belonging is a bit probably higher on truth than to other people. And I
Yes,
think
I've
like
noticed that, especially in poker, actually.
yeah, and also for people on the spectrum in general, I think like it's easier because the value
Yes.
of truth is higher, right? They're just saying a thing honestly, because why else would you say something else? It's like, why do
Well,
these words not mean what these words are supposed to mean? Because
well, you have to. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do understand why, by the way, people do these kinds of things, but I think they're just deluding themselves. I mean, this is my personal view. But basically, I just think that this leads to a lot of like games being played that kind of ultimately cause lots of pain. Let's put it like that. And I mean, I see why they're doing it, but it's very short-sighted, is my view. Um,
yeah, I
I
agree.
mean, I see why people view this as socially intelligent. No, no,
But
it's
I
really
agree that
not.
it's short-sighted, and that's why I also agree that valuing truth highly doesn't have to necessarily lead to pain. It's actually like my perspective and that of many people is oh wow, it's maybe a short-term discomfort for long-term benefit is kind of how proven to be wrong usually is, right? It's short term.
Yes.
Overall, you benefit from it, except if you're in your dying last 5 minutes or something. But
Yeah. Well, that's where.
so therefore, why would you feel pain at all then about it if it's just short term and net positive overall? So that's why I think you can actually have truth as an kind of optimization function as well. It just happens to be that we right now value other things more. But yeah, also on because you were going about the different values, I think pleasure, like what is it, like just pure hedonic pleasure, like okay, maybe that's I don't mean to describe that usually when I talk about it. What I more mean is whatever anyone personally defines as their happiness, which might be
Sure.
full, like mega meaning, very low in personal happiness, the ability
Yeah.
to give all the time, or belonging, or whatever, right? Like in the end, we all have slightly different
Oh
preferences
yes, of
among these
course.
typical domains, but the thing that should be enabled more with less scarcity, which again is enabled by more energy and more intelligence, which is due to more AI. Through that, we should then also have more abundance of all these things, so more ability to live out kind of our preferences. So maybe just one's preferences is the kind of most higher category thing to describe them.
Sure. On this, I do agree. I want to say what my perception is on this, which is so this all comes from how people have loaded their values, and they can actually be changed through various different experiences. Like the neurobiology can be changed. I mean, this is actually what yoga and breathwork does. It changes the neurobiology of like how your nerves interact with these kinds of feelings, so that you deal with stress in a better way. This is what they can do, which is, I think this is really compelling evidence of like, how did they know to do this like 5,000 years ago? Maybe something was up. I don't know what though, but it just seems very striking to me that meditation and all these sorts of things do in fact change these things.
They didn't have a phone, or they didn't have many distractions
Oh yeah.
to
I
spend
mean,
their
that's a
time
very
with.
good point. In truth, they didn't like they may not have reached the true point of being able to deal with all kinds of stimulus in like an equitable and appropriate in a way that really like optimized for the best ways of doing things. And I think that basically this is just a function of biological conditioning and like genetic strategies and things like that. I mean, from a certain perspective, everything can be interpreted as rational. What is rational then might be to reconfigure oneself towards these hypothetical potential possibilities, or at least nudge oneself towards that, which is what I'm personally like looking into doing. I mean, this is the whole point of doing
You're
yoga.
trying
This
to
is
change your
exactly.
value.
Yes. Well, to see that maybe there's a different way of having your value system that benefits you more overall, instead of like, I mean, the simplest example is, what if you're hooked on cocaine? This is a really good example. The high that you get from cocaine and the down that you get from not getting cocaine, in this isolated perspective, it makes sense for you to go get cocaine. Like that is actually morally correct, or excuse me, not morally correct, but it's makes the most sense for you. It's
Hopefully
like
it's
you
your
got to get
preference.
this cocaine, or you're getting screwed over. But this causes all kinds of problems in the rest of your life, where you might realize maybe there's a better way of like not getting drugged up on cocaine. And I'm just like basically saying, well, everything's kind of a drug in a way, unless you're using things for pure healthy possibilities, in which case then it might make sense to pursue the possibility that those healthy possibilities are in fact better. Now that's a hard thing to sell to people, but I mean, they have sold it in some ways. Like yoga essentially is one variation of selling it. Like this podcast was an attempt to do that. I mean, a lot of rational, effective giving probably does aim at doing such things in terms of showing people, well, you may feel positive about helping the homeless guy and giving the money, but this isn't going to actually help solve their problem. It's just going to, it might even perpetuate their problem sometimes. And, there's ways of reconfiguring. It's also through cinema and movies and things like that, to like influence people in certain kind of ways. Like if like through a movie or whatever, that a certain evil exists, you might behave differently, or you might like, your value system would change a little bit. Anyway, um, But
Yeah,
I
you can
think this,
definitely change your value system. Like your value systems probably change anyway, a little bit over time.
yes, they
Um,
do. I think
and you
so.
can also change them in a directed, active effort. And yeah, there is a yeah. I think different people have different, like, again, preferences on whether do you want to just be the kind of like Buddhistic, like, always I have no unfulfilled desires, hence I am completely at peace and in a state of eternal bliss on the basis of not missing anything. I don't know. I'm more of a roller coaster type guy. I like I like the, as you pointed out, the unpredictability of stuff. I want a little bit of unpredictability for full heaven. Um, I don't, the total, remove all desires. I'm probably not giving the strongest description of Buddhism, but in either case, I think, yeah, I want a little bit of struggle. I want a little bit
Okay.
of desire and chase. I want a
So
bit of competition.
I don't think that the Buddha. I want to investigate myself, but I don't think the Buddha necessarily meant no roller coasters at all, but rather to not let the to look at it like kind of like the way that you might look at his poker hand. Like you will get some poker hands in a roller coaster. Like what is the point of life if there's no roller coasters of some kind? I mean, life is essentially like an experiential roller coaster. I mean, this is why we enjoy roller
Hmm.
coasters. But like when you play a poker hand and you get really flustered and upset, it would be you would still feel that emotion, but you're in total control over it, and you're no longer like bound to react in a way that hurts you
Hmm.
overall. It would be more like setting your desires where they should be. Is how I personally
Okay.
understand Buddhism.
Yeah. So maybe I was giving it the wrong description. Yeah. Okay. As long as I can have roller coasters, I'm okay with Buddhism.
I think well, you see other people that have potentially achieved the equivalent of Buddhism, such as like Krishna, for example. He had some fucking roller coasters. Um,
Okay.
but other maybe some other people too. I mean, you would maybe consider like Christ one of these people. Um, but like the whole point of these other guys was to show like you didn't have to live a monastic life and just like go live in a cave and like
Mm.
achieve this highest state. I mean, otherwise, what would be the point of everything else? That's my personal view on things. Really hard to sell. Uh, I mean, it intrigues me anyway. Um, all I really advocate is because it just everything's got to have its place. It's just like possibly to in poker there's like a hierarchy of things that matter when you're looking at a hand and trying to decide the best decision. And I think it's
Hmm.
just basically the same for life as well. Like you probably don't want to have snorting cocaine and getting really heavily addicted on cocaine is really high up on that list, or maybe something's
Hmm.
wrong. This is just my
Hmm.
personal perspective, or there's probably much better ways of dealing with things. And I would think that that's my personal guess is that's probably the optimal way of living is just having your neurobiology sorted out in the right kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, specifically around nutrition. I mean, addictions are kind of generally a thing that breaks it a bit, probably. But around
Hmm.
nutrition, it's particularly hard, probably, right? Like where
Oh yeah, yeah.
we desire, like, now we can have sugar on tap, and we're only into it because it was a hard to find resource back then, and that's why you would just like gorge on it as soon as you can. And now it's just
Yeah,
available all the time, so you're literally kind of like a kid in the candy bar candy shop
that's
at
how
all
I feel
times.
all the time. Yeah, that's how I
Well,
feel all the time.
fortunate thing for you, my taste buds adjusted very quickly. Like many, like, I don't know if many, but 7, 8 years ago or so, I kind of just went through a eating much less sugar for about a month or two, or no sugar basically. At least no, like, yeah, uh, directly sweets. You end up having like similar things like sugars, but yeah, my taste buds adjusted where I just don't crave it now anymore. I don't know, probably people are different, but now I'm kind of happier with. I feel as happy having a savory thing and I often order as a dessert. Like I just want a starter or more of the main, or a beer
Yeah.
or something. Like a savory thing rather than this. So you kind of.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should go that route. I mean, maybe I have not kicked sugar, as it turns out. Maybe I
Well,
really should.
kind of combines
Huh?
multiple things, right? You can do the 1 month like yoga style, being okay with this unfulfilled desire of yours, just noticing it and letting it pass, while also improving your taste buds.
Maybe I should. That's not a bad idea. I almost did it
How
for
about doing it for a
ayahuasca, in
month?
fact.
February, just February. February
More
is
like
even the
March.
shortest month of all. I'm giving you the easiest possible month as an option here.
It would be March. It can't be February, as it turns out. But I am looking into that precisely. And
What sugar plans do you have in February already?
uh, it's more like I'm just doing stuff in February. But as a matter of
Okay.
fact, one of the things I've looked into is the idea. Like I think the whole modern society is hypersexualized.
Hmm.
That's another one of those things. But that's another discussion. I mean, there's lots of examples. I mean, apparently, like a teenager these days seeing more women naked than like by like a factor of 1,000 times or some crazy amount compared to all his ancestors ever. Until the whatever the 1980s or whatever it was. All this stuff is yeah, I mean that's a big one. We should talk more about Reg and your involvement with Elon Musk. It sounds like you really like the stuff behind Reg and the kind of research you're doing for him.
So yeah, the idea of Reg was to find places where the dollar goes further within the area of philanthropy, right? And for that, we used many other organizations as kind of our guiding light on figuring out what these effective charities are that we were then recommending to poker players. So, and that's kind of a similar thing that the Musk Foundation also aims to do. And then there are like a set of beliefs about the world that we also shared, which is why it made sense, which is that well, one, you should focus on like having higher bang for your buck. Two, that you will find those places if you look at the medium term future, so something like the next 5 to 50 years rather than today, and that you should look at places that are currently neglected as well, or where you can make a relevant difference on the margin is what matters. So it might be the case that something has already $1 billion of funding, some area, but actually its scale is so large and they're going into a totally wrong direction that maybe small amounts of money can still be helpful. But usually it's the case that the more money an area receives, the less impact you will have, right? Diminishing returns basically as well,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
on spending the next $1 million. Anyway, so like there were a bunch of things that we believed between the Musk Foundation and Reg, and that's why I ended up working at it.
Yeah, it makes quite a bit of sense. I mean, it just applies the concept of like, why when you go into this idea of like more and more, why not get more pleasure? Why not also do more good? I mean, when you look at this concept of pleasure, it seems that inevitably you have to get to the concept of doing good
For what
because
it's worth, I wanna just tag in here saying that the doing good is definitely a much broader category than philanthropy. So you can do a lot of good with for-profit businesses, obviously, as
oh,
well.
I know, yes.
Even like
Matter of
most good
fact,
happens via for-profit businesses. The way how I've seen philanthropy for a while now is that if you can do a task or project as a for-profit business, probably in most cases you should.
yeah, I think so
Sometimes
too.
sometimes you though have externalities. So something um, like yeah, like very dangerous virus research has the externality of, well, it could just leak and create a pandemic, or like various ways of cattle farming have the externality of deforestation, etc. So then there are
Oh, that's
questions whether
interesting.
you should approach it with that way. But like
Okay, you kind
markets are great, but markets aren't designed for. Markets have their issues sometimes, and usually it's externalities or that some people can't participate. Anyhow, so if you can solve it via markets, solve it via markets. Then if you can't solve it via markets, usually that's where the government is meant to step in. So that's why we're currently discussing things like a carbon tax, or why like social welfare programs exist as well. It's like the government saying, hey, markets don't sufficiently work for the poorest people in our society. They can't really contribute with their capital or their labor. So therefore we will kind of take away from there and give it there. So that's where the government usually steps in. Or because of other issues. But sometimes markets aren't designed for it. The government is blind to the issue. And I think that's where philanthropy should be stepping in. And that, I believe, applied at the time for AI safety research and for pandemic prevention work, as well as for depopulation research. Climate change was for a while a very good nonprofit thing, and I think there are still a ton of opportunities. But actually, climate change is now slowly becoming a valuable for-profit pursuit as well, right? Where you can have decarbonization efforts of various size as a for-profit business. Even though that's kind of still like in between. Does it really work as a for-profit? It's unclear because there is uncertainty of whether you can have carbon capture work that well. And there is also, the timeline is so long. For-profit businesses don't like having the profit be in 30 years, right? Or in 20. They want it to be ideally in 10. And non-profits and governments have ideally those longer timelines where they're okay if the benefit happens in 20 years. That's usually one factor.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Actually, you answered something I've been wondering about, which is where does nonprofit even benefit or make sense to apply in comparison to profit? Because a big thing that seemed to be the case is that, if you give too much and help too much in a certain way, people become dependent on it, and it actually does more harm than good, even though it has good meaning. And it's actually better to get people to be independent in a lot of situations rather than get them to have short-term help. But that's, I did not know that about that. Well, do you see any role in poker players, especially, or like the whole concept of poker playing in this? I mean, do you think there's like a major role for poker players in rational, effective giving, or do you think it's better suited for like the academics and these guys that are running, what was it, effective altruism? Because I heard actually there's some issues with that too. As fun of
Tons of issues.
Seems like
yeah. So one, I think poker players their minds usually are very well designed to solve all sorts of difficult problems. So theoretically, I think, or we are pretty well suited for a variety of tasks because we can think against the grain. That's kind of how we train our mind to be. And also we're training our mind to have a psychological element. So that's good for dealing with people, etc. I think there's a lot of potential. The difficulty for most poker players is, can you work for someone else? Because we're all used to working for ourselves, right? And can you do something you might not enjoy that much for 3 months in a row or even 12 months in a row? Because sometimes doing a project requires doing a relatively boring task for a long time. So those are two questions. It's like discipline and working for someone else, loss of authority. And then one needs to decide it. But otherwise, I think the minds are very well fit and still among the most kind of like the best problem solvers, I think, that I've met. And then on EA, EA has pretty similar minds in many ways, and but it's definitely more conformist than poker players are.
Really?
But also EA had a bunch of other issues. Like, I mean, obviously the whole thing around SBF happened, even though my take there is that, one, definitely EA like pushed him as well, but he was also pushed by the whole world, really. Like the guy was the darling of the US and of every like published paper for like the year 22 and 21. He was like described as the next trillionaire. Sequoia wrote this article where they basically went down on their knees and, to him. There was just a lot of hype. And the other point I would make around that is, it's like, okay, it's kind of weird. It's going to be pretty controversial, but I think it's pretty damn weird that there is an area which has historically been seen as too do-goodery, or like just like, oh, it's all these people trying to do good things. No scandals, or like very tiny. The scandals are like, hey, this guy has inappropriately addressed some person, or they have sex parties or whatever. Those are the types of scandals. That's EA. And then there's an area that is crypto, where there are frauds happening like every month. There are many, many massive companies, massive billionaires that turned out to have done illegal things all the time. It's just like the name of the game. Not the name of the game, but one of the names of the game. And now one guy from here goes here and does a bad thing. And then these people are all like, this is where the bad came from. It's like, really? What the f***? How did you do this sleight of hand? I don't even quite understand. Because he claimed he would, in the end, give it all away. It's like he's donated 100 million or so out of a net worth that self-reported was between 10 billion and 100 billion at different times. So because he donated between 0.1 and 1%, these guys are at fault for his creation, where he even beforehand, while he worked at Jane Street in between, which is kind of like a middle zone, right? It's trading company, hedge fund. Anyway, so there he didn't do fraud as far as we know. And then he went to crypto and started doing fraud. So there is an aspect of his mind having been bred to be the type that would do bad things, for sure. And EA has a part in that to play, without a doubt, due to the like naive utilitarian focus sometimes and the quantification focus, etc. But then the environment is also responsible a little bit. Like he didn't do fraud in Jane Street. As far as we know, he didn't. As far as we know, he didn't do it before, and then he starts doing it in crypto. It's like, can we make it such that crypto doesn't allow for frauds to occur as easily? Not via centralization or something, I'm not suggesting that, but anyhow. Yeah, that was one of the things. But EA definitely has a role to play around SBF, 100%, and they have been like doing a lot of soul searching. I think it may be best for EA to kind of change quite a bit. And I think EA has done a mistake that has also led in part to SBF, which is EA has assumed that it is now an answer to all sorts of things in life, like all sorts of problems. But in fact, it is not a framework that applies to whether going out and doing like gay rights protests in the past were a valuable thing to do or not. Like EA just doesn't have a framework for it. It's not good at answing those questions.
Right, that does make sense to me. That's kind of the
yeah.
that's
Also,
kind of the
EA shouldn't be applied in your daily life. Like you like, are you gonna treat your loved one that you're with and just like quantify every interaction you have with them and try to find the best bang for your like time spent? Like directionally maybe, but are you gonna quantify it? No, you fucking weirdo, stop it. Just human it up a little bit. Anyway, so I think I think EA has kind of overstepped quite a bit, and that in part has led to SBF, I think. And it in either case has overstepped, and I think it should stay probably presently in the domain of the things it's good at, which is quantifiable near-term giving, and also identifying problems like pandemics and AI that other people aren't looking at yet.
I think that there's a bit of an error in like the logic of EA, where, and I think this is one of the biggest issues with utilitarianism, is that it doesn't value something like free choice enough. And I had to come around to this conclusion myself. I probably thought a lot like an EA person at some point also. Not to mention, when you start, like, there has something to be said for quantifying every little thing. It begs the question of, like, okay, well, you're putting energy into quantifying things. What about this? And instead of just enjoying things. And, like, if you're going to quantify every thing, what's the point of life again? It actually does make sense. In fact, it's in fact more logical that it doesn't really make sense to optimize everything. This is in fact less logical than the idea of experiencing things for what they are. And in fact, so the biological organisms going through life as they do, as inefficient or whatever. I mean, there's always more and more efficient, is actually more rational than this idea of like attaining some kind of perfection. It's like, well, why? Why do that? What if that's not the the part of the value system. This is also a value system to attain something like perfection, which is one thing I realized. And I was like, oh, this is a kind of crazy thing to realize. Like, it's just something about me that I tend to be recursively self-improving. But not everyone exists like that. And at some point I realized it's actually not really fair for me to impose my value system on other people. I realized like they have to decide for themselves what's really right, because what is right, ironically, it's as if like from my view, it's as if every organism has to figure that out for itself, or and then from there you derive ethics and things like that. It doesn't can't go the other way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Though, so free choice can be part of utilitarianism. You have something called preference utilitarianism, where it's just about fulfilling the preference of people. And there's like welfare version of it. There is a preference version of it, because preference is kind of the higher order, better descriptor of it that includes things like meaning instead of happiness. But in either case, you can't really do utilitarianism if with our like relatively puny little minds that we have, right? Like we just can't quantify everything. So why even try? It's just better in many ways to say, this broadly makes me feel good, or I believe that these virtues are relevant and I want to foster these virtues in my life, or this is a good heuristic. So I think most people live with a mixture between some virtue ethics things, some deontological things, some utilitarian things. When you run a business, you're probably doing more utilitarian stuff for what it's worth. But I think also the part that there is no like inherent outside truth that you kind of alluded to, I agree with strongly. Well, on the aspect of what the right ethics is. Currently, if you ask, there are surveys sometimes around of philosophy students or PhDs around which of the three main directions of ethics they favor. And it's basically an even split between those three theories of utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and deontology. We just don't know. Like, we don't know whether the universe is designed in a way which dictates a version of ethics, or it doesn't even. And I think there are a bunch of questions that follow from that, where really everyone needs to make up their own choice. I think some questions like...
I think you kind of nailed it. It's like people, at some point, that's kind of what people have to figure out somehow, is to you can influence his choices to some degree, but at the end of the day, it's still, people really need to figure out for themselves. You can't force the decision.
So that's why with reg,
in my view. Huh?
Yeah, and with reg and I think the good parts of EA, I think what it does is not tell you specifically that is the only thing you have to do, but to, for example, say you're into animal welfare and you want to help, and you can help for the same amount of money, for like $1 million, you can save 1,000 cows or 1,000,000 chickens. It's like, well, do you value one cow more or 1,000 chickens? Different people will have different answers, and we don't in fact have a like truth-based answer of like how we should value their experience relative to each other. Probably at one cow versus one chicken, you would rather save the cow. At one cow versus like 1 billion chickens, you would probably rather save the 1 billion chickens. And stuff in between is just murky. And like we can look at how big is their brain size or how many neurons do they have, but that's not really a good answer because there are different ratios of pain perceptors. Does pain even matter, or is it more about well-being? We just don't know. So I think like what we can do is give you the numbers. Hey, you can do this one charity which achieves that much good for that amount of money, or this one which achieves this much, and now you choose.
Yeah, I more or less agree. I mean, I think you can present all the facts, and people can have the decision to assess based on whatever the facts are or not, or go with whatever their choice. I do think that really free will of sorts, from a certain perspective, I mean, everything is like more or less. One thing I realized is that from a certain perspective, things are more or less inevitable, but there is free will under that. I mean, they're not exactly inevitable, but the rough conclusions are, because of like the way that you can say emotions work, whatever it is.
But
like,
do you think we also have the sufficient I think we don't have sufficient knowledge to make it actually computable. So like even if some things might be deterministic or inevitable, it's like
No,
can we find
can't
out?
make it computable.
We're
No, I
kind
don't
of
think
to
so.
an
But
interesting
you
thing.
can.
I think it was Bostrom who said that it's not that human minds are so incredibly advanced and crazy good, and that's why we're building AI, etc. But rather, the perspective he gave is human minds are the minimum viable thing to create technology in the first place that can create AI. We're like
Sounds right.
barely smart enough to do stuff, you know? So sometimes with these questions of like, oh, can we compute it? It's like, well, we can't, but maybe it is computable, just not by us. So we might as well treat it as if it's not.
Yeah, it's not for sure. We can't compute it. It just seems as though like, I mean, your willpower like averages out at some kind of point. If you start pushing yourself in different directions, it averages out. It fizzles out or whatever. Even with like variability of like X number of things, I mean, people are still going to follow their own same consistencies at the end of the
Mhm.
day, and even develop in relatively, well, not even a relative thing, but in ways that can be that kind of work out to some variation of inevitability. It's kind of the same with poker in that, that like there's all kinds of like nonsense that happens in between. But if someone has an edge, it happens. Like it or if someone has the
It shows
tendency to
up over
evolve, they're
time.
gonna
Right.
huh?
It shows up over time. Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
I mean, you can look at a lot of different things like that. It appears that that's true. I mean, a lot of it turns out that many people had their like, or even in history, there's many like events that were effectively inevitable. These major events, but there's variability in between, such as like there was this, people had their various like India had its own Leonardo, for example. I forget what his name was, but other
Mm.
sages and other societies had their own like world movers at like a relatively predictable frequency. Interestingly,
Mm.
and many of the historic events were almost like the biggest ones were actually like not really random. They just were
Yeah,
going to
something like
happen.
probably the Industrial Revolution, I would imagine, just has to happen at some point after
Oh yeah,
you, like, you don't know whether it's going to happen in those years specifically, but once you can capture and move energy and then start building motors, etc., you'll just at some point develop rather the ideas to use that
yes,
energy in some way.
yeah. In fact, everyone's industrial revolution was predictable except for Africa's because all the other continents basically just totally shafted Africa. It was on course until
Hmm.
basically this happened for the slave trade and all that. I don't know like a ton about it, but like that was a really interesting thing in history. But maybe maybe
That
there's
was a
some kind of
pretty
upswing
fucky
in there
thing.
somewhere, huh?
Yeah, it was a pretty fucky thing. Liv just
Yeah,
released
really.
a podcast with Magot Wade. They're talking specifically actually about kind of the question, why is Africa so poor?
Yeah,
And she has an interesting lens where she's describing it as like the point being that they've developed too many regulations and are often like too socialistic, where basically
interesting.
entrepreneurial spirit just doesn't work for a variety of reasons, which is a
You know,
different lens to take than this we haven't helped them enough, etc. thing, you know.
interesting.
It's
Okay, I've
cool.
heard like kind of the opposite perspective where like everyone in Ghana is effectively an entrepreneur.
Well, yeah,
So
that's
I don't know.
it's
Like,
worth checking her out. She's from Senegal herself. It's the Win-Win podcast with Liv Boeree.
yeah. I should check it out at some point. Anyway, I really have to go, but it's been
Hmm.
great having you, Igor, and thank you for all your insights and all these kinds of things.